Today we are going to be talking about unmasking the cancer experience, what COVID means for cancer patients. You can interact and ask questions via the chat function and the Q&A. Please remember that all of our sessions are meant to be informational, and any treatment decisions should be made with your healthcare team. So now I'm going to turn it over to Gwen Nickel.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I thought we'd talk about what's on everyone's mind, which is COVID-19. And if we can have the first slide, I'll be able to go forward with what we're hoping to cover today. So we've called this Unmasking the Cancer Experience because we really need to understand what COVID means for cancer patients. And so I am the Chief Medical Officer at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And obviously, because our role is to be an advocate for patients, when the pandemic started, we took this very seriously and began to learn everything we could about how to help patients keep themselves safe. So if we can go to the next slide. I'm hoping today that you'll leave with a better understanding of what exactly is immunocompromise, what does your doctor know about how you respond to the vaccine. I want to talk a little bit about the LLS registry and what it means to be a citizen scientist, and tell you a little bit about what LLS researchers have learned and what we still have left to understand about COVID and the vaccines. I hope you'll feel that you have some good ideas about how to keep yourself protected and the impact this may have or may not have on your cancer and treatment, and then resources that LLS has available for blood cancer survivors. So if we can go to the next slide. It's no surprise to anyone, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a challenge for everyone, cancer patients and all people. But cancer patients have had what I think of as a double whammy. They have the double worry of how the pandemic affects their health, like all of us do, but the other worry about how will it affect my cancer and my cancer treatment. And early in the pandemic, it was clear a lot of people had their therapy disrupted, interruptions, delays in starting their therapy or continuing their therapy because it threw all of us into chaos, and clinics didn't know how to keep patients safe, how to keep their staff safe. Fortunately, that rapidly was solved in terms of new ways and new safety protocols, but it means that there have been stricter safety rules for visitors, for caregivers, and for the staff. And it makes what can be an isolating experience, which is to be going through cancer therapy, even more isolating. And so what I'd like to talk about is that the rollout of the vaccines and the antiviral therapies has happened so quickly that we're experiencing science in real time. And because of that, it's led to a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty, and the information keeps changing and the advice keeps changing. It's hard to keep up with it. And it's hard to know what's good quality advice. Now, as a scientist, this is normal. I know that science changes all the time and that we adjust based on new learning. But I don't think that it's comforting to a cancer patient when their doctor says, I don't know. And so the world is actually becoming much more aware of how science is conducted and of really the learning and adapting process, which is normal for scientific discovery. As we learn things, we change our standards, our opinions, And so in order to be as safe and as healthy as you possibly can be, patients, caregivers, and healthcare providers all need to arm themselves with as much good quality information as they can and update it. So I thought the best place to start was to talk about the immune system and immunocompromised, because cancer patients hear this word thrown around, and certainly the CDC has used it and said immunocompromised people should get additional vaccination. But how do you know if you're an immunocompromised person? Well, I think the best way is to start with what exactly is the immune system. And in its simplest form, it's cells from the bone marrow, the white blood cells that circulate in your blood, and the proteins that those cells make, which are antibodies. And this system works together with other cells in your system to protect you from foreign pathogens. Now, when someone says that, what do they mean? Well, that means anything that can give you an infection, whether that's a bacteria, a virus, a parasite, or a fungus. Because the white blood cells are a critical component of immune function, when the white cells are decreased in number or they're decreased in their ability to function from chemo, from infection, from medication, from disease itself, patients are more susceptible to infection. And so patients whose cancer involves the white blood cells or whose treatment for cancer kills white blood cells, and in particular, the lymphocytes, these patients are at particular risk because the cancer therapy that they're getting is designed to kill the very cells that make antibody to vaccines and to help fight infection. And this is why many patients, when they're getting chemo, are told to be careful about infections and to watch for fever, because they don't have the normal ability to fight pathogens when their white blood cells are low. Patients whose cancers, particularly blood cancers, and very particularly those with B-cell malignancies like chronic lymphocytic leukemia and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and multiple myeloma, these patients may be immunocompromised both from their disease and from their treatment. Next slide. So we also hear the term pre-existing conditions bantered about, and certainly having a cancer is a pre-existing condition. And so we know that this makes you in a susceptible group, even if you aren't over the age of 65 or you don't have other pre-existing conditions like heart disease or diabetes. And early in the pandemic, we at LLS saw that patients with hematologic malignancies or blood cancers had worse outcomes when they were infected with COVID-19 as compared with age-matched patients who don't have blood cancer. And what made this very frightening was that cancer patients were largely excluded from the vaccine trials. And so while I know why that happened, that it was important to test in the larger healthy population first, it left doctors not knowing if the vaccines would be safe and if they would work for blood cancer patients. So we at LLS, when we realized that the vaccines at the end of last year, that the vaccines were rolling out and that our patients were likely in line to get vaccines, we really thought we needed to answer some questions as rapidly as possible. And those questions were, what is the safety and the effectiveness of vaccination in blood cancer patients? The second is, do different diseases or treatments change the response of a patient to getting vaccinated? And third, should patients who we know are immunocompromised get more than one vaccine or more than two vaccines? And will it be better? Is more better? And so I'll tell you a little bit about what we decided to do. Well, first, we met with as many blood cancer scientists as we could who were doing work in this area, and we provided emergency grant funding for some clinical studies of vaccine effectiveness in different blood cancer populations. But we know that clinical studies can take a year or more to be completed, and we needed the information as soon as possible. So the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society had a patient registry where patients had provided information and electronic health records to tell us about different scientific questions. But it really was in beta testing. We weren't using it except for occasional small questions, but COVID gave us a reason to expand this. And so what we did was create a clinical trial, a consent form, and have it approved by the IRB so that we could ask patients questions about how they responded to the vaccine, what side effects they had, and then another group of patients included in that larger group to have antibody testing done after their vaccination to see if it was as effective as it was in the healthy volunteers who were in the initial vaccination studies. So this is an ongoing project, and the purpose is to examine the safety and the effectiveness of SARS-CoV-2 vaccination in blood cancer patients. And if we can go to the next slide. The good news is early on, we were able to look at more than 3,500 patients who were kind enough to fill out the surveys, who wanted to help patients like themselves and be part of what we call citizen scientists. And I should stop for a minute because I am just so impressed with the patients who agreed to do this. It's all online, but it's work to go in, to do the consent forms, to fill out the surveys. And people did this not just to help themselves, but to help each other. And I found that so inspiring, I have to say. I really give a lot of credit to all of the patients who participated in this research. And the good news that I can tell you is that the side effect profile is almost exactly the same as that in the healthy volunteers who were in the initial studies. There were a lot of sore arms, people felt tired, they had some flu-like symptoms, but the most important in this large group of patients, the initial adverse events, serious ones, were less than 1% of patients had things like allergic reactions or shortness of breath. And that really helped us be able to say to patients, it is safe for you to get the vaccine, talk to your doctor. And so that was the first thing we wanted to report. We can go to the next slide. This shows you that of that group, of that initial cohort, we had over 2,200 patients agree to get their blood tested. And this was incredibly important because we needed to see all the different disease types that are blood cancer. You may or may not know that blood cancers are not just leukemia, lymphoma, and myeloma. Each one of these subcategories can be divided into multiple other types of blood cancer, and they each have a different clinical course and different treatments. And as you can see from the demographic slide here, we had a large number of patients who had CLL or chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and that is really thanks to a partnership with the CLL Society. We had patients with myeloma, we had leukemia patients, we had Waldenstrom's patients, thanks to the Waldenstrom's Foundation, and all the smaller ones many of those are different subtypes of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So we had a very nice distribution of different blood cancers to see if both the type of cancer and the treatment affected the vaccine efficacy. And I'll point out over on the left that the great majority of patients got the mRNA vaccines, which are the Pfizer and the Moderna. And so all of the rest of my comments are related to those two vaccines. We had very few patients who'd gotten other vaccines. We can go to the next slide. Now, I know this is hard to read, especially if you're listening to this on a telephone, but the story can be told even if you can't read the fine print. We looked at antibody response to the vaccine by blood cancer diagnosis. The darker rust color is patients who made antibodies. And for different types, for instance, Hodgkin's disease, multiple myeloma, chronic myelogenous leukemia, the great bulk of patients made antibody after their vaccination. But the lighter color, flesh color on this slide is important to see also, because out of our group of 2,200, 23% of patients failed to make any antibody at all 2 weeks after their second mRNA vaccine, so after the full initial series of vaccination. We know that in the studies of healthy patients who got the vaccine, 95% or more had a full response with antibody production. While we do not know what is a safe amount of antibody to make, it is clear that making no antibody is not good and puts you at risk for breakthrough infection. And the areas where this in the blood cancer space are most obvious are in the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma patients and the CLL, chronic lymphocytic leukemia patients. So people whose cancers involve B lymphocytes. The reason I say this is because it means most other cancer patients and many of the blood cancer patients made a full antibody response and should be able to fight COVID in the same way that the healthy people in the studies to get the emergency use authorization the same way they did. And so while we focus, because the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society is focused on blood cancer, this to us was good news for most cancer patients. The people where it was not good news are those patients who have B-cell malignancies. And we were very concerned that these patients would have a high risk of breakthrough infection after vaccination, and that they might go out into the world thinking, well, I'm vaccinated, so I can let go my guard a little bit. Can we go to the next slide? So we dug down into treatments and we looked at chronic lymphocytic leukemia because that was our biggest group of patients and a group that had a high percentage of people who did not make an antibody response. And we found that survivors, so either people who were watching and waiting and weren't actively being treated, or people who had had treatment in the past, a small percentage of those were still what we call seronegative, which means they didn't make antibody. So even the disease itself, because it affects the cells that make antibody, can cause people not to make a good antibody response. And the other common therapies, when used alone or in combination, had increasing percentages of patients who didn't make antibody. So both disease and treatment can affect the ability to respond to the vaccination. So what did we do with this information? Well, we immediately informed healthcare providers, caregivers, blood cancer patients, including those who had completed their treatment, that they may still be at risk for breakthrough infection and should continue to use precautions. We also went to many of the pharmaceutical manufacturers who are making new antibody cocktails and new antiviral therapies and said, please, 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 we need you to test these in our immunocompromised patients because they're at risk from low antibody production. And we continued to look at response in our registry. Now, I think I should make one, I want to stop here because I know that people are concerned because the CDC had said that antibody levels, if you go to the CDC website, and I really would encourage you to go to the CDC website, it's a very helpful site. They have said that getting antibody testing is not recommended. And why do they say that when I've just told you that we just tested thousands of patients for antibody level? Well, there are a couple of reasons, and they don't want people using this randomly to decide they're safe. Because we don't know that that means you're safe. We just know that it's better than making no antibody. The antibody tests were designed to test for COVID and not, for whether you'd been exposed to the virus. And so they really weren't designed to be testing what we're looking at, which is vaccine response. And as I said before, we do not know what level of antibody gives you full protection. And finally, we don't know what yet to do for people who have a low antibody response. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we studied to help us understand what to do for people with low antibody response. Next slide. So we have now in the registry over 1,500 patients who've gotten a third shot after their first two shots of the vaccine. And it's about a 50-50 mix of Moderna and Pfizer. All of these patients agreed to have additional blood testing done, but we have only analyzed the first 100 or so and are in the process right now of analyzing the rest of these patients as they get to the point after their booster and have gotten their blood testing done. So I'm just going to tell you about 72 patients, which is a small number, but we believe this will hold up in our larger data set. Of these 72 patients, and all of these patients were patients who had B-cell derived blood cancers, 65% of them were seronegative or did not make any detectable antibody before their booster shot. And 35% of them had an antibody response, but it wasn't at the full level of antibody, but they and their doctors decided they should get a booster shot. Of that group, there were 35 whose levels went up. There were 32% who had no response, And there were 33% who went from 0 to positive. So this was actually very promising to us that boosters seem to be helping people, even those who were negative after two vaccinations. And if we can go to the next slide. So if we just take the 47 patients who were negative before they got the booster shot, 51% of them in this small group made more antibody. And that is really promising, that for almost half of the patients, maybe even more, they just need a little bit more to push them over the edge to be able to make an antibody response. This is great news. And so we really encouraged all of our patients to consider themselves immunosuppressed and to talk to their doctor about getting a third shot. And again, this is the group of 25 patients who had some level of antibody before they got the booster, but didn't have a full antibody response. Every single one of these patients had elevation of their antibody response after the booster. Also, very good news. And many of these patients were on the very therapies that we said in the last slide can inhibit your ability to make an antibody. So we were very, very encouraged by this. And again, published this and have been out talking about the fact that this booster seems to be effective for immunocompromised patients. Next slide. So this is sort of what I just said, but we published this and we testified at the CDC panel on boosters for immunocompromised patients. And this led to the authorization of the third shot for people who are immunocompromised. And we consider almost all blood cancer patients and survivors immunocompromised. And frankly, I would consider all cancer patients potentially immunocompromised. So even if you're not 65, talk to your doctor about getting a booster if you haven't. Or we should call it a third shot, but it's really hopeful that many patients get that additional boost from the booster. But I have to encourage you all that breakthrough infections and poor outcomes are still possible in cancer patients. And there are still patients who do not respond even to the booster. And so we have been suggesting that all cancer patients get vaccinated, but act unvaccinated. And by that, I mean, do not expose yourself to people who are not vaccinated. Try and limit your time in enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces. Social distance whenever you can. Strict hand washing. All the things that all of us have been doing during the pandemic. For people whose immune systems may not be normal, we are encouraging you and those around you to get vaccinated but act unvaccinated. Next slide. So here are a few things we still don't know, and in another minute or two we can do some Q&A. But one of the things we don't know is the specific dosing and timing of how medications affect your ability to respond to vaccines. And LLS researchers and many other researchers are looking at this very intensely, and I'm very hopeful that we will learn this for this pandemic and also for future viral problems, flu, anything else where we have to know how people respond. We need to understand why some people respond and some people do not. We also need to know what other parts of the immune system may provide some help, some compensation for people who don't make antibody. And we really do believe this is the case. And there's a lot of research. I simplified what immunocompromise is down to just one cell and antibodies, but there are many other cells in the immune system. And we are hopeful that some cells, like your T cells, may be able to compensate when you can't make a normal amount of antibody. And then we're very, very hopeful, and there are now clinical trials ongoing for antiviral medications and antibody cocktails against COVID that may be used in a preventative fashion. And what I mean by that, right now they are emergency use approved for people who have been exposed to COVID. But we are talking about people who are at high risk, who don't have a normal antibody response. Could we protect patients by using some of these medications to compensate while the immune system is compromised? And lots of clinical trials ongoing and about to start. So what are the options for people who don't respond to the vaccines? Well, as I said, you should get a third shot and a booster after the third shot, but you still need to act unvaccinated. You should consider, if you know you're immunocompromised, or your doctor says, I'm concerned that you're immunocompromised, to consider a clinical trial. And they are going to increasingly, over this next few months, become available around the United States. There are antibodies, there are viral targeted therapies, and most importantly, if you have been exposed to COVID-19, alert your healthcare provider as soon as possible. Do not wait. Do not wait to see if you feel badly. If you've been exposed, tell them right away. Antibody and antiviral therapies work best right away after exposure. And once you're sick, they don't work as well. So please, please, that's something that everyone should know. If you are someone who's at risk because of a pre-existing condition of any kind, tell your doctor immediately if you've been exposed. Next slide. I just want to make a small pitch here for the wonderful resources we have for blood cancer patients at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. We have information specialists who are oncology professionals who answer the phone Monday through Friday and provide free personalized assistance both to patients, healthcare providers, and families. And this is educational information, financial information, and assistance, and to help with all kinds of support, including counseling, including nutritional support. We have a registered dietitian we can help you meet with. We also have clinical trial nurse navigators. So if you are interested in finding one of these clinical trials, these nurses will help you find those trials or a therapy trial. And there's an 800 number, there's a live chat, you can email, you can go on the website. There are many, many different ways to reach these professionals. And this is entirely free, and we hope you'll feel free to take advantage of this. There is also quite extensive COVID-19 information on our website at lls.org/COVID-19, and you can find a whole page with Q&A and frequently asked questions. Next slide. So it would be wrong of me not to thank all the people who helped us do this great work, including our pharmaceutical partners, my colleagues at LLS, some of our colleagues at the Mayo Clinic who helped us with the statistical analyses, Citizen, who is our website, LabCorp and Adaptive, who are the laboratory colleagues, and the Garrel family, who gave the initial funding to start the LLS patient registry. And now this slide is already out of date. We have over 12,000 patients who have agreed to be citizen scientists to help move science forward by being part of the solution. And I owe them a real debt of gratitude, because I wouldn't be able to be here giving you this information today if they had not been willing to provide their own personal experience to LLS. So thank you, and I'm absolutely ready to answer questions.
All right, and I have a few that came in the chat. So one of our participants said, I have lung cancer and I'm really fearful of getting COVID. It looks like this session is a little bit more related to blood cancers. Do you have any more information about lung cancer and COVID vaccines?
Well, we do have information about how well the vaccine works in other cancers, not from our research, but from researchers around the world. And the good news is that even patients actively getting chemotherapy and immunotherapy, the great majority of those patients are able to make an antibody response to the vaccines. So there is a little bit of assurance there that you have the antibody and ability to fight COVID-19. I still think it is very important to be sure everyone around you is vaccinated, and that you explain to the people you work with, live with, interact with, why it's important that they get vaccinated or they socially distance, because you're trying to stay alive. And I know that's difficult for people. That conversation is a difficult one because this has become so politicized, but it's not a political issue. It's a health issue, and it's your health. So yes, you should be concerned because lung cancer is a pre-existing condition. But the good news is you should, after being vaccinated, make antibody. But get your booster and as soon as you're able to.
All right, another question that came in. Were the patients involved in the study pre-treatment, post-treatment, or a mix of both? What about pre and post-transplant when applicable?
Absolutely great question. And it is a mixture of both. And we looked at that separately. So we looked at people who'd been treated and currently had not been on treatment for the last 2 years, whether that is people who were before their treatment or after their treatment. And then we looked at people post-transplant. And we are doing a study with the National Marrow Transplant Registry to look specifically at what is the right timing post-transplant. Our best estimate right now is that at day 100 after transplant, which is when we think your immune system comes back to normal, you should be able, post-transplant, to respond to the vaccine. But during that immediate post-transplant period, you may be at high risk and should be very, very cautious. So we do know people that are a long distance out from their transplant, usually, at least for blood cancer, so transplanted for AML, transplant for a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, most of these patients were able to make antibody. Again, antibody is not the entire answer because we know breakthrough infection happens in people who are fully vaccinated. So you still should remain cautious, but it should make you feel a bit better that you should not be as likely to get as sick if you do get exposed to COVID. And we do believe that folks after transplant should be able to respond. And I want to put this caveat in, if you are a patient who is on immunosuppressive medicines for graft versus host disease after an allogeneic transplant, a transplant from someone else, you are likely to continue to be immunosuppressed, and you may not make antibodies, but the great majority of people did. And so I talked to your doctor specifically about the medications you're on and the likelihood that you have had a response to the vaccine. But that's what we learned from the registry. We did see post-transplant patients who were able to fully respond.
All right. Is LLS studying prophylactic monoclonal antibody treatments for those of us with no antibody responses after 3 shots?
Well, we're not studying that, but we did go to many of the manufacturers, and I'm happy to report that there is a study that Regeneron is doing. There are a number of studies now. There's a study at Montefiore looking at a 4th vaccine. The Mayo Clinic is hoping to open a study with antibody therapy exactly for the people who are immunosuppressed and do not respond to the vaccine. And so I'd encourage you to talk to your doctors about participating in these trials, and they are going to be opening over the next months around the United States. So they will be available. Right now there are only a few sites. The last I heard, there are only a few sites open for these trials, but over the next months, they're going to be open for prophylactic treatment. And we aren't doing the trials, but what we are doing is talking to every manufacturer who has it and saying, please include immunosuppressed patients in your studies.
All right. Thank you for that. When you say cancer patients may not respond well to the 3rd COVID shot, does this apply to only those having radiation or chemo? What about taking hormone blockers?
Well, it is likely that hormonal agents will not impact your ability to make an antibody. And we even saw people who were getting standard chemotherapy who were able to respond. So the greatest immunosuppression seems to come from those patients where they have a long period where their B lymphocytes, their white blood cells, are kept low. And there's no reason to think that hormonal therapy should do that. It's, of course, every case is individual, and you should talk to your doctor about the specifics of your case, but there is no a priori reason to think that you wouldn't respond as other cancer patients have with the ability to make an antibody.
Any idea how AL amyloidosis, in addition to myeloma, complicates the situation?
It's a great question, and I have to say, no, I don't know. The good news is that it seems that the majority of patients with myeloma are able to make antibody. There are certainly, both our series, which was around 10 to 12%, did not. Other series see a little bit higher, 15 to 20%. That still means 80% of patients, including those on active therapy, are able to make some antibody. So there's reason to believe that amyloidosis and AL in particular will respond similarly, but we did not have those patients in our registry.
All right, last question. Our healthcare authority has not approved antibodies for early treatment or B-cell cancer patients on rituximab. Recipients who delivered COVID if they have been vaccinated. Are there any studies that I can provide to support these treatments for these at-risk patients?
So I believe that, and I don't want to be sure to say that I know all the inclusion and exclusion criteria, but the current trials with the antibody cocktails that are opening for immunocompromised patients to get the antibody cocktails will include anyone who is seronegative, who does not make antibody, regardless of why they are seronegative, whether that is from Rituxan or other therapies. And to get the specific details, I'd encourage you to call the LLS clinical trial nurse navigators, because they have a deep knowledge of all the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and also know where the trials are opening, where they're open, and where they're going to open. So they can keep you abreast of, is there a trial that your patient or you can go on?
Well, thank you so much for that, Glenn. Do you have any last comments you want to make?
I just hope that what I've given you in terms of information has been helpful. It is obviously skewed towards blood cancer patients because that is my expertise. But I don't want people to walk away frightened. I want people to walk away informed, and take care of yourself, please.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and what a wonderful conversation we just had. So when this Zoom ends, I'm going to ask everyone to please go back to GVCC21.com, log in, and from the homepage, you will find the button that says Happening Now. This will take you to the next live session. Thanks so much.